Whoa, did you hear that?
Yeah. We're real now.
That's the first time that's happened for me. So no. And now again, I'm recording, I think, using my Stevens Point account. So we'll see where it ends up.
Yeah. I'll follow your lead, Eric, whenever you want to
Sure.
get us going.
I guess we might as well get started. If you're joining in, most of you are joining, I think, via the Zoom meeting. You can see who the different folks are that have checked into the room using the participants. There's also a chat function that you can use if you wanted to ask questions. You can also unmute yourself and join in at any time. If I do find that you're unmuted and we're picking up background audio, I might go ahead and mute you on purpose. This presentation, we're inviting Jeremy Solin just to give sort of a preliminary look at the information he's been collecting and the analysis he's done, kind of looking at the Lakes Partnership Network from a fresh set of eyes and trying to understand us sort of as a complex and sometimes complicated system. So I'm not going to take any more of his time because, again, I mentioned earlier we are a little tight on time, so I'll turn things over to Jeremy.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. And thanks, everybody, for joining in this morning. As Eric mentioned, I'm Jeremy Solin. I've been working on this project for about 6 months. I'm part of UW Extension, where I've been for about 8 years in a variety of different roles, most recently working with a national project called Think Water, and then with the Natural Resource Educator Program, doing some planning with them. But as I mentioned and Eric mentioned, for the last little bit here, we've been looking at the network and doing a bit of an analysis. And so as you see on the screen there, hopefully today is just to do a little bit of kind of orientation to the project and the report, and then share a little bit, kind of introduce you to the report that's in draft state right now, to initiate some discussion and hopefully to lead you into taking the time to look at that and giving us feedback as this moves ahead. So I'm hoping that I kind of wrap up my presentation piece in about a half an hour, and then we'll have time for discussion. So what I want to do is give you just a little bit of background and kind of context. Most of you are familiar with the Lakes Partnership, but I just kind of want to make sure everybody's at least on some similar page of some context there. Talk a little bit about the project itself, and then jump into some specific pieces of the project. So we'll talk about the inventory a little bit, talk about some of the gaps that are identified, some of the kind of potential partners moving forward, specifically around kind of a new-ish formalized structure that we're calling the Lake Monitoring and Protection Network, which I'll touch on here a little bit. And then talk about what I see as some strategic decisions to make as this work moves forward, and then we'll have some discussion time. If there's anything that's like really burning as I go over it, feel free to jump in or drop a comment in. But generally, we'll hold the most of the conversation to the end just to make sure we can kind of get through the core of this. And Eric, if you wouldn't mind kind of monitoring comments and tracking people, if that works all right for you, that'd be helpful.
Will do.
All right. So a little bit of kind of the background context of this. Kind of 3 pieces I want to talk about around what I'm going to generally call watershed restoration protection efforts in the state, Natural Resources 193, and then the Lakes Partnership at kind of multiple scales. So many of you have seen this before, but Eric and a number of colleagues worked on this over the past couple of years, but it's basically, mapping and trying to understand watershed restoration activities in the state relative to kind of organizational capacity. So I'm just going to touch on this, but Eric has lots more information on this if you want to get into this more. But the general situation as we know it is that a lot of things affect water quality. We have a pretty good understanding on the biophysical side of, what's going on in watersheds and what kind of impacts are happening and potentially what kind of restoration activities can take place to restore water quality in watersheds. And we spent a lot of time and effort developing the science behind those. But just as equally important is what Eric generally refers to as kind of the left side of the model here, is the kind of capital and capacity of the organizations that are doing this work. So the social aspect of this work is kind of the foundation of the assessment that we've done, but that gets into kind of what is the ability of nonprofit, often volunteer-led organizations to carry out restoration and protection activities, right? And that's not a simple thing to figure out, and it's not a consistent thing across groups, but there are some frameworks kind of behind how we can begin to think about these things. So the upshot of all of that is that the organizations and the network of organizations that exist in the state is an important part, and a part that we need to pay probably more attention to moving forward, as we're interested in water quality in the state. So that's that little piece. Natural Resources 193. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Most of you are familiar with this. Allie can get you lots more details here, but essentially the basis of this is there's funding here to support surface water monitoring and protection across the state. There's a fairly substantial amount of money to do that work. And there have been recent updates to streamline some of that, and also to allow for additional kind of contracting with some of that money. And through that process, DNR is interested in kind of establishing this network that we're calling the Lake Monitoring and Protection Network, that would provide some of the core services that seem to be consistent kind of across past grant applications and grant and efforts related to monitoring of water quality and aquatic invasive species, outreach, education, and management in the state. And so this has actually been piloted with Beaver Creek Reserve through a contract with them to provide these services in a designated area, and that's moving forward over the next year. So with these changes, there is a desire to better understand this network and the Lakes Partnership more broadly, to begin to identify, are there gaps in the network that need to be addressed? How can we strategically invest these contract dollars to support organizations? And how do we, as that network gets established, how do we support that network moving forward and make sure it's as effective as possible? So I guess I'll leave that there, but that's an important part of the context of this work. And then finally, the Lakes Partnership. Again, I'll just touch on a few key things here. The partnership really is an amazing network in the state, and there's kind of multiple scales of it. It's really formed around these three key partners of Wisconsin Lakes, UW Extension Lakes, and DNR, essentially providing services to lake organizations. But then there's another scale that is this broader network. So I just want to touch on that a little bit, just to give some idea of what this looks like on the ground, and also get a sense of some of the complexity. But at the core of this, mapped on here is a water body. It could be a lake or a stream, really. But and there's a group, a lake organization or a watershed group that's some way involved in that water body, focused on monitoring and protection of that. That's kind of what I think of as this, the core unit of all of this work. And the Lakes Partnership is formed around essentially making sure those organizations have the resources and capacity to do that work. So you see Extension Lakes, DNR, and Wisconsin Lakes kind of all have distinct roles in helping and supporting those organizations. And then, but that, you know, I think probably when this partnership formed, it probably was that simple in some ways, you know, 30 some years ago. But in reality, this partnership is much broader than that. There's a whole host of other organizations involved. And some of that is kind of captured formally through, again, what we're calling this Lake Monitoring and Protection Network, so that there are county conservation, land and water conservation departments directly involved in this work and receiving funding through DNR, and regional nonprofit organizations that are, again, are providing some of these core services to local groups. And then there's, of course, a much broader kind of less formal partnership that includes watershed groups, land trusts, farmer-led watershed groups, universities, DATCAP, you know, and on kind of down the list, all interacting in a variety of different ways, kind of depending on the specific lake, and kind of setting that they're in. So it is this broader network that we tried to get a picture of during this project. So that little bit of context, get into the project itself. So this is the project that we've been working on for about 6 months. Includes kind of 5 key deliverables focused on doing an inventory of the organizations, agencies, institutions involved in the broader partnership. What are their areas of responsibility? Kind of what's their staff capacity, organizational capacity to do this type of work? And all of this is kind of aimed, you know, towards this eye of building this lake protection network, and thinking about gaps along the way. So we'll talk about some of these gaps, looking at geographic gaps in organizations, the programmatic gaps of what's happening at the statewide and local level, and then also some of the relational gaps that exist. And again, aiming towards how do we kind of intentionally and strategically build this lake protection network. So thinking about who are the potential partners and kind of what are their characteristics, who can provide a variety of core services that are identified over on this side, to what we're thinking of as, you know, like network participants. So these are primarily lake associations, other nonprofit organizations like watershed groups, who can support healthy lakes, right? And so we'll share the report, the beginnings of the report today, with the kind of focus on the report being used in strategic planning by the Lakes Partnership moving forward. So that's all the background and kind of orientation to the project. So now I'm going to jump into some of the things that we did. So the first piece is an inventory. I'm not going to go through kind of the details of that, because it's a long list. The report right now is about 30 pages, and probably 20 of that is the inventory of organizations. But I just want to talk a little bit about kind of how we've captured some of that and what's in there. So basically, we looked at a variety of organizations across the state. This is a fairly comprehensive list of the type of organizations that we looked at. So scroll all the way down here. So we looked at those organizations, and we were particularly interested in, you know, kind of who are they, where do they work, what is their geographic scope, what do they focus on, you know, are they focused on aquatic invasive species, are they doing restoration activities, you know, what kind of work are they focused on, and then finally what was their staffing. And we approached this and got this information from a variety of different ways. I did about 40 some interviews of representing kind of this long list of organizations in the state. And those came about from initial recommendations from DNR and Extension Lakes, and then kind of snowballed from there. So I asked people for recommendations for other people to talk to. And then we also, there are a variety of existing lists kind of across the spectrum that are held by, on the DNR's website, on other organizations' websites, particularly related to some of the watershed groups. River Alliance of Wisconsin, has lists, so a host of online kind of searching as well, and then existing reports and things like that to basically capture that inventory. But I want to spend more time kind of on the identified gaps, some of these potential partners, what this network might look like in the future, and then these strategic decisions over the next 15 minutes. So gaps that were identified, again, I looked at these in kind of from three lenses: geographic gaps, programmatic gaps, and relational gaps. I should mention that part of this work is to build systems maps of all these organizations. That work is still in progress. I've built a crazy, messy map that I'm not going to show you because it's kind of a little bit hard on the eyes and brain. So I'm reworking that, probably using kind of a regional scale. But those maps will be part of the report ultimately as well. Those will take a little bit longer to develop. But that helped to identify some of these gaps. Oops. So geographic gaps, most of you already kind of have a sense of this, but generally the landscapes that are dominated by streams and rivers in the state have fewer organizations connected to those water bodies. And so those regions have fewer organizations involved. And in particular, the driftless area is one of those. There's some coverage into some of the regions by Beaver Creek Reserve and some of the watershed organizations, but there's a pretty substantial gap, particularly of regional organizations in the driftless, and that's kind of emphasized by the status of Southwest Badger RC&D that was serving that area. That isn't currently, they still exist as an organization, but don't have any staff capacity. And then the RC&D that's up in the Eau Claire area, which is river country, is kind of in a similar situation that they have a little bit more staff capacity, but very little staff capacity. So you see that region kind of underrepresented by regional organizations, but local organizations as well. And then Northwest Wisconsin, essentially the Lake Superior watershed, which is dominated by streams and rivers, was covered by Superior Rivers Watershed Association, but that's in a similar state right now. So there's a geographic gap there. And then there's an interesting one that kind of pops up in north central Wisconsin, which includes Langley, Lincoln, some of Oneida, Price, Sawyer, and Rusk counties that have a lot of local organizations, but not any regional, at least active regional organizations that are providing support to those organizations. There are county lake associations and local lake associations and watershed groups, but nothing at the regional scale. So those are two geographic gaps that were identified. Programmatic gaps, there are a few kind of key ones. One of them has to do with kind of the status of these local groups. In most cases, these are completely volunteer-run organizations, both at the local level and in places where there are county lake associations or waterway associations. Those are also volunteer-run, and they vary incredibly in their capacity, in their membership, in their leadership status, and all of those. And so programmatically, we don't really have kind of a fully developed program that's providing support to those organizations to can help them to build capacity around things like strategic planning, transition planning, leadership development. Lake Leaders is, part of that, but not specifically focused on the organizational aspect. So that's a programmatic gap. Obviously, this one is just being built, but the Lake Monitoring Partnership Network, as that is built, we don't currently have a program in place to take coordination of that. So there's a gap there. And then this is a bit out of the scope of the project, but this came up in multiple conversations. And there's work going on in this right now, obviously, but how we protect high quality water bodies. We're pretty good at responding to issues, but identifying, prioritizing healthier, high quality water bodies and protecting.
Jeremy, your mic might be kind of clipping in and out. If you can have
Okay.
a way to boost the mic or make sure you're close to it.
Yeah, it might have been because I had a little announcement thing pop up, so hopefully that's better now.
Yes, better now.
Okay. So those are programmatic gaps, and then relational gaps, which I think are perhaps kind of the most interesting out of all these, to me at least, is that generally the partnership is really good around the traditional relationships, as I talked about, between extension lakes and local lake organizations and, Wisconsin lakes. All of those relationships are pretty strong and functional. But there are new players on the landscape, particularly farmer-led watershed groups, land trusts, kind of high-capacity watershed organizations, I think like the St. Croix River Association, and they're kind of less strong relationships built between those types of organizations and the local lake and watershed associations. Obviously, there are exceptions there, but generally there's a gap there. First Nations relationships, I think those would, generally at the state level, everybody I've talked to would say those are improving, but still have work to go. But there's often not a relationship again at the local level. So there are a few cases where local lake organizations, watershed groups have reached out to First Nations for partnership, but those are kind of the exceptions. So more opportunities there. And then finally, kind of at the larger scale, there's an interesting kind of breakdown I see at the landscape level where there is, in areas that are agriculturally dominated landscapes, DATCAP plays significant role in those areas. Natural Resource Conservation Service plays a significant role there. And generally, there's less relationship with those organizations and local groups than there is between DNR and local groups. So some opportunities there as well that we identified. So those are the gaps. So then moving into some of the establishment of the monitoring and protection network. Again, kind of two aspects to this of like as we look to establish this network, what are the important characteristics of these partners, and then who potentially are these partners? And this is, I would say, a starting point for these characteristics or criteria, but they obviously need to have staff capacity and expertise in this type of work. They need to be willing to contribute to the broader Lakes partnership, so involved in things like convention planning, sharing with other people, hosting tours, things like that. I think there's a lot of opportunity to build this network at the local scale. So thinking of these regional coordinators, not just as service providers, but really as regional coordinators to build that network, potentially to help build some of these relational gaps, or address some of these relational gaps, build relationships in their regions, contributing to the organizational and demographic diversity of the network, as is the case in all natural resources work. I'd say in Wisconsin, we're not very diverse in or demographics. So I think that's an important point to consider, but we also need to make sure we're kind of looking in an innovative way of what types of organizations could be involved and contribute to the network. Again, commitment to learning and sharing. You know, the one thing about networks and any of this work at the beginning point, we're not going to get it right, perfectly right. And so we want organizations who are willing to kind of learn through that process. This piece is really important, I think, the representation of partner audience organizations in the governance of those partner organizations. And I'll use the Lakeshore Natural Resources Partnership as an example here. That's on the Lake Michigan, in the Lake Michigan watershed, primarily focused in the region of the Niagara Escarpment. But their governance board is made up of the partners that they serve. So they're a true kind of network, and they serve as an umbrella administrative and planning organization with their partner and member organizations. And that structure seems to build a really tight relationship between the service provider, like Lakeshore Natural Resources Partnership, and their audiences that they're working with. That's not the case with a lot of other organizations across the state. So this idea of representation and governance is important. Obviously, a related idea is that there's strong relationships with the organizations in their region. They need to have some financial and administrative capacity. And I think it's going to be important to identify distinct service areas and to minimize competition between these regional organizations. That's something that currently exists. And I've found, in talking with organizations. And so kind of minimizing that competition between organizations, I think, is going to be important. And that can be done geographically. And as we look at potential organizations across the state, this is basically the list I come up with that fit some of those things, but not necessarily all of them. So you'll see the RC&Ds are on here. There's a number of regional watershed organizations, a few other nonprofit organizations. And so these are all, again, kind of possibility of organizations that could do this work. I'm not necessarily saying they're the right ones, at this time, but they're the possibilities, and that's described in a little bit more detail in the report. And then finally, the last piece of this is related to some key strategic decisions that I see need to be made within the partnership moving forward. There are 5 of them here. The first one relates directly to these characteristics that I just talked about, but what are those capacities and criteria basically for those organizations to be able to advance that work? Again, this is a starting point, but more work to be done there. Probably one that's maybe the most critical of this is how best to support this network moving forward. So Eric likes to say that relationships are infrastructure, right? And which is really key to any network. And so as we're building a network, it's really important to figure out, how do we build relationships between these organizations? How do we build relationships between these regional organizations and the core of the Lakes Partnership, DNR, Extension Lakes, and Wisconsin Lakes? And that can't just be left to chance. That's probably going to take a staff person to do that coordination and facilitation within that network. So I think that's a really key piece of figuring out how we do that. Another decision moving forward is, how do we kind of help to build these connections among local organizations? So again, some of these non-traditional partners, is that handled by the regional coordinators, or is that something that we dedicate a statewide position to? What might that look like? In the report, we referenced multiple times the scaling up report that came out of the regional extension watershed network. So we don't, right now, there's no way there's enough funding or capacity to carry out watershed restoration at the scale that needs to happen. And in this report, they identified probably a Huck 10 or Huck 12 kind of scale that needs some dedicated staff capacity to provide coordination. We're pretty far from that scale right now. So how do we begin to think about scaling up that work? And are there kind of non-traditional funding sources or strategies that we can think about to do that? And then bring this one back again. Again, how do we think about ensuring protection of existing high quality or healthy surface water, particularly lakes? So those are decisions to make moving forward. And I'm hoping that gives you enough kind of sense of the report and enough kind of content to chew on that we can jump into some discussion here. Happy to answer questions, but then also look forward to your feedback on the report as you see it too. The plan is that I will we'll send the report out later today so that you get a chance to look at it. There's a meeting next week with the Lakes Partnership that we'll use some of that to focus conversation on, but we'll be taking feedback over the next month or so on the report as well. So I'll open it up from there.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I guess I wanted to mention that too. I should have mentioned that earlier. The purpose of this meeting too is to prep us for a gathering taking place next Tuesday, where we're going to talk about sort of where to go next with the Lake Monitoring and Protection Network, and think about some sort of decision points that are on the near-term horizon. So rather than going into that meeting and having to spend sort of this kind of time just doing a presentation and discussion, or giving people a draft of Jeremy's report and having people sort of maybe not read it until they get to the meeting, we figured having this meeting now would give Jeremy a chance to present. Giving you the draft report as a follow-up to this meeting might prompt you to take a look at that report and digest it. And then when we get together next week, Tuesday, we can have a pretty informed and productive discussion. So I guess with that, I'll help moderate discussions here, and I'll open it up for your questions. And keep in mind, if you're muted right now, you'll need to unmute either your phone or your computer for us to hear you.
So I'll give you a related question to chew on a little bit. Some of you have been involved in kind of the development of this report or interviewed, and a variety of ways you've been involved. Are there things you expected to see in here that you're not seeing? In a sense, are there gaps in the report that you were expecting to see, or you would find helpful to see?
Hey, Jeremy, this is Allie. Fantastic start. Thank you so much for walking us through this. It'd be great to get the link to this Plectica just to help that give us a chance to kind of poke around in addition to looking at your report.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess so. A lot of different things came to mind. I guess I can start at kind of a small one. In terms of understanding the gaps at the regional scale. So just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, when you looked at like Langlade and Lincoln and Oneida, those are areas where you realized that there was no nonprofit or other kind of entity taking a multi-county approach. I'm just kind of trying to figure out like what exactly was the scale here that constituted regional. And the reason I ask that is because the way that we've written the network program, the counties have first right of refusal. when the allocation amounts are small, it would make sense to group multiple counties, but then there are certain counties with so many resources and so many people and so many lakes, they have relatively large allocations. They're interested in just taking a county by county approach in their
Right.
area. So I was wondering, in your inventory, was there any, that the regional approach may be appropriate for some areas versus others? Was it
Yeah.
clear, and you're talking to folks, like where like a smaller scale approach might fit somebody's plans or the need?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm a little afraid you said you're starting with a small, easy one. So it'll be interesting to see where we go from here, Allie.
Well, it did get complicated as I kept talking. So
Okay, good.
that does happen.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of complicated in that way. I would say generally my bias was towards a multi-county approach, just because I think there's value in talking with folks of kind of sharing resources and strategies across a broader region. But that said, I'm sure there are exceptions. Vilas County comes to mind, obviously. But generally, when I was looking at gaps, it was kind of like, are there organizations that are kind of working across multiple counties who could, in a sense, like build deeper relationships, provide services across not just, kind of the traditional set of organizations that are working together, but think about that more broadly, and also thinking about that from the network standpoint, the effort to kind of, in a sense, like cover the state geographically makes more sense to me to do that at a multi-county scale than county by county. So yeah, that was a intentional bias, I guess, in thinking about that. And we can think about ways of like, is it worth noting the exceptions in that? Because like Vilas is an interesting one in the sense that there are organizations kind of fulfilling that role, like North Lakeland Discovery Center, who are, not quite multi-county, although a little bit. So they're, a bit of an exception in there. But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's great to have like the inventory and to know kind of where our potential partners are. I do think there's a role for us to play in developing the network, in kind of identifying opportunities for counties, but I do think we need to be thinking about having those conversations with the counties, because those are going to be the folks that are essentially in the decision-making seat.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
I guess this is also a time just to share a reaction to this and to share maybe your thoughts about the Lakes Monitoring and Protection Network as well.
Hey everybody, this is Mike, Wisconsin Lakes. Hopefully I'll formulate this question intelligently, Jeremy, but I'm wondering, so we've got geographic gaps and then we've got programmatic gaps. Does the report look at, so like take for instance, the example of north central Wisconsin where there are geographic gaps. Did you look at whether the services that those regional entities might be providing are actually being provided by other groups, either, like you said, at a local level, maybe a more local organization within Vilas County, or even up at a state level, like us or River Alliance or something like that? Like I'm curious,
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised too, even about the northwestern Wisconsin gaps, because whether there are also programmatic gaps in those places that aren't being already covered by other entities.
Yeah, that's also a good point, Mike. So it gets complicated, obviously, right? So because there are so many players, which is an amazing part of Wisconsin, and also somewhat of a challenging thing to capture it in some way that makes sense. So so like if you were to say, again, if we use Vilas County, is there an organization that's kind of providing these services? And I should go back to this one. So the Lake Monitoring Protection Network services that were identified as part of the rule update are essentially these. I think those are pretty close, Allie, right?
Pretty much, yep.
Yeah, there might be some nuanced differences in there. So I kind of use those as the lens to think about those gaps. But I kind of treated them as a package. I didn't break them down to say like, I don't know, in Lang Lake County, is someone providing, some of these things? Yes, there is someone, who's doing that work. There are, Chris Arrowwood is a AIS contact there, and their relationships with the statewide organizations, like you mentioned, in some of those cases. But the kind of lens was from that broader network standpoint, where they're kind of, in a sense, like package gaps where maybe there were isolated services being provided, but not as a whole. Whereas if you look at, let's say, like Vilas County, North Lakeland Discovery Center, the combination between the county and County Land and Water and the North Lakeland Discovery Center and potentially a few other partners there, kind of collectively, are they providing all of these things essentially? So that one didn't pop out as much as of a gap. The one in like northwestern Wisconsin, I think a lot of that gap is really because of the situation with Superior River's watershed, where they were doing a lot of that work. Some of it has been picked up, and I was actually debating, trying to figure out how to capture this, and it doesn't seem well formed enough to capture it. But there is the Lake Superior Collaborative, which is kind of a interinstitutional effort, is doing some of this work, but it's still informational stages. So yeah, I would say, they're, any way you cut these things, I think there are kind of gaps in the rationale or the outputs. You could cut them in different ways. So I think, I'm definitely open to continuing to think about those. Is it if it's useful to kind of get down to a finer scale, then let's do it. But thinking about the purpose of like building this network, is it useful to go a finer scale or not? I think that's the kind of lens we want to use. So anyway, that's a long rambling response to say, like, yes, there are definitely gaps that way, I would say, and those are key points. Did I answer that, Mike? Or
yeah, that was
that
okay. Was helpful, and okay. I'll echo what everyone else has said. Great presentation. This is really helpful, and I'm looking forward to talking more about it next week too. I'll just throw in an aside on a couple of things that, in terms of like things that are happening literally as we speak, that could impact partnership with other external groups like producer-led councils. There's going to be legislation released in the very, if it's not coming out this afternoon, I imagine it'll be coming out in a few days, that'll include opening up lake management grants to or lake protection grant funds to producer-led council, so they'll be an eligible entity for surface water grant applications under the bill, which will only help to encourage that kind of collaboration.
Yeah, cool, great, thank you.
Did we map those groups?
Yeah, yep, I've captured them in the inventory. And in the written report, and this, I'm trying to think how this will play out in the map itself, but I guess I'll just say in the written report, in the case where a website exists that lists all of the organizations, essentially I just link to that website because it's going to be, you know, more up to date than any kind of static listing. So DATCAP maintains a list of all the watershed groups, the farmer-led watershed groups. In the map, I will put, those will be in there. The farmer-led watershed groups will be in the map. I'm not putting in the individual lake groups in the map for reasons you can, you know, understand. That's all you have on the map. They're kind of the background in a sense, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Interested to think a little bit more about the organizational training recommendation. I guess first sort of a logistic question with the organizational training need. Where was that in the map? Can you?
The capacity development.
Oh, that's, yep, capacity
There's
development
that
and non.
piece
Yep.
to it,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's also the coordination aspect of the network itself.
Yep. Talking more about the nonprofit organization capacity development. So that's specifically with respect to the network. So you are identifying the need for capacity development in order to create the ability to operate as a network cooperator, or was that kind of more of a general observation of something that would help the network overall?
So this one, this capacity development is more general in a sense, but particularly related to lake orgs, both local and countywide. So that was kind of around the idea of they're all at such different kind of stages, and pretty much everybody I've talked to, even when we identify a high capacity local organization, the caveat is, well, 3 years ago, they weren't really doing anything, but they found someone who's doing something and now they're really active. Or, you know.
Jeremy, your mic is kind of coming and going again.
Oops, sorry. So there's so much variability and inconsistency, I would say, across these organizations within their own capacity, that, and in particular, the leadership piece came up in pretty much every conversation I had with people about either local or countywide groups, is that the organization was so dependent on a single leader, and when they had the right person, they were doing really well, and when they didn't, you know, they weren't functioning well. So it's thinking about that broader effort of how do we build organizational capacity within those groups, including how do we think about leadership transition, membership recruitment, and all of those things. So that's what that piece is about. And then the other one, this one, is about how do we think about coordination of this network as it forms, to make sure that we're, you know, also building capacity within those organizations, and supporting their work. Basically, from this idea of networks aren't very good at coordinating themselves, right? We need coordination for them to effectively function.
Okay, and so you see that person, sort of a staff position, that person would be responsible for, logistic coordination, making sure people knew what was expected of them and how the grant or award process works, but then also attending to those organizations' capacity needs and helping them with professional development. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think of, like Jeremy mentioned, the point of looking at Lakeshore Natural Resource Partnership and their sort of organizational structure, and thinking through how, if there are desirable characteristics of a network nodes governance, how do we spread that? How do we make it sort of contagious, or how do we get the idea of, like, hey, here's some tips on how your regional NGO board might optimize its governance, right? No, it's not really Lakeshore Natural Resource Partnership's responsibility to disseminate that idea to other potential boards, but someone needs to be sort of Johnny Appleseed sharing those ideas across the state so that we can have better governance. And maybe we need to look, this might be, I don't want to be pessimistic, but look at some places where things aren't working so well and be like, all right, how do we learn from that failure or those challenges in order to ensure that they don't become sort of a negative contagion, sort of a here's how you don't go down the rabbit hole that this group went down, or don't find yourself in a situation that another group found themselves in. And again, you certainly can't expect the failing organization to take it upon themselves to somehow share their sad lessons with other groups to warn them.
Yeah, but I do think that mentorship angle, like the positive examples, is a really powerful one. You're right, maybe we won't get the sad stories, but I think I've heard from a number of people that a leadership training opportunity would be welcome. And maybe that's something that we can look to some of our higher capacity organizations that you helped identify, Jeremy, to kind of create, a mentoring community or something with a leadership workshop. Say we can invite some of our higher capacity people to do some presentations on how they run their ships.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I do think we have an opportunity now to think about lake leaders, for example, in terms of what its future is. We've been always, I think, struggling, or I don't say always, but for the last several iterations, struggling with the tensions that come up when we have a really diverse group, in the sense of there's some folks who are doing this work sort of professionally and they're getting paid to do it, and they're mixed in with the folks who are volunteers who are doing this because they're on their lake association board or they're on a countywide board. And they do have slightly different needs. There's positives of having them cross-pollinate, but there also could be some gains to be made by having sort of tracks or programs that are geared more towards specific audiences within this universe of people.
Great idea.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Mark. How's it going?
Hey, Mark.
Hey. So I'm just trying to understand all this. So great work as far as identifying, the structure and presenting this. So that I'm clear, the gaps you identified were kind of specific to the Lake Protection Network. That's kind of what you're presenting now. And I want to make sure I understand that. But then when I see like farmer-led watershed groups and with implementation, how does that factor into, do you have gaps identified for farmer-led groups and areas of implementation? Is that going to be part of the report?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, the gaps were kind of viewed, the identification of the gaps were viewed from that lens of the Lake Monitoring and Protection Network. So again, kind of with this eye of these kind of what called the core services, and thinking about it at a little bit of a regional scale. So that's the approach that I use to identify gaps. And there's some other the inventory, in a sense, can be used to identify local gaps as well. I didn't pull those out, but the farmer-led watershed councils, it'd be fairly easy to, I guess, get a sense of the geographic gaps within those councils. I didn't get to the point, though, specifically related to those groups, to look at like organizational capacity, gaps or anything like that. I've talked with a couple of them and maybe have some sense of what those might be, but that wasn't the specific intent, to look at the gaps by particular type of organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess what I'm hearing is that you interviewed or evaluated them, but with an eye more on the network services and how it relates to that versus, what their building support for implementation of like practices or things like that. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that'd be accurate. And then also, I was in particular paying attention to some of the relationships between organizations. So, some of those came out, but that's not specific to a specific farmer-led watershed group. But yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
And Jeremy, if you go back to the outline of the report and you go over to the far right, the decision points.
Yep.
I think we're kind of, that middle one is sort of about where we're at right now. Is like, what are some ideal strategies for going about this? We do certainly want to build those relationships. We do want to share ideas and experiences and information, but we want to do it in sort of an optimal fashion and try to learn, I guess, from what's working at the local level as well.
Right.
This prospect, for example, of the lake grants being available to those groups, I think we'd want to think through. If it's a nonprofit lake association, we already have sort of a set of standards and a bar that they have to pass to sort of exist as an entity that is eligible. So we call them qualified lake organizations. In the sense of these former LEDs, I don't know if we have something similar, or if we'd have to develop that and then talk about what that means.
Yeah. I think that's an important point. I think the other interesting point, which we'll talk about more next week too, but to Allie's earlier point that the counties are the decision makers, kind of in a sense of, well, specifically in a sense of how they use the allotted funding. And I think there's what is the approach in a sense to building the network when there isn't necessarily control over kind of how those funds get expended. They're expended for a particular purpose, but we may or may not know if they're going to go to a broader regional network or if they're going to stay local, until or as things develop. And yet, you probably want to begin showcasing the value of in I would say, at least in most cases, a regional approach to this work, without having the whole network established, right? It's going to be a building process. So thinking about it kind of from a evolutionary standpoint too, is going to be an interesting part of that.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate in that there is sort of an annual cycle that happens both naturally and sort of programmatically and budgetarily, and that every fall is going to be a chance to sort of get some folks together and think about, well, how did that go? 2021, how did it, what were the lessons learned and how do we quickly adapt and tweak things for 2022 so that we're always getting a little better.
Yeah. Yeah. Since it's 12, maybe a couple just quick logistical questions for Eric and Allie. I have a couple of updates to make on the draft report yet, but then should I just send it? Who wants to distribute it, I guess? Or what's the best way to do that?
I can do that.
Okay.
Thanks, Allie.
Yeah, I'll send it to you, Allie, and then I'll also include the link to this Plectica map.
And I guess I would say CC myself and Mike Engelson.
Okay.
Allie's probably the key point to get it to folks with sort of DNR email addresses. And then I can make sure that everyone in Extension Lakes has it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to send that out with a final agenda that Carol and I have been working on too. So this is probably not for this call, but I'd like to touch base with you guys in the very near term to see if you have any ideas about structure and timing for the meeting.
Sure.
All right. Sounds good.
And I don't know how much of deep interest this would be because it's pretty wonky, but I'm assuming we're keeping this internal for the moment. Not necessarily something to be sharing publicly, or are we ready to?
Yeah, I would say internal-ish. I think I wrote this on the front of the report.
Okay.
Whatever that, you know. Yeah. Yeah.
And the notion is that this is a draft as well. I should have mentioned this earlier. Jeremy still has a timeline that keeps him sort of attached to this, probably into March. Is that right, Jeremy? Kind of February, March?
Yeah, at least through the end of February, but I mean, I'll be around.
So this draft is also meant to be for review and for, it's not like a final draft. The idea here is to provide feedback to Jeremy to help him optimize the report itself.
Got it.
And to Mark's question, if we wanted to tweak the analysis for some other variables related to farmer leads, we might still be able to do something like that.
Yeah, we can try to plug some other pieces in there for sure. Yeah, whatever seems of value, just let me know.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.